Psychopathia Mentalis, written by me and narrated by me. Stanisław Pawłowski. Introduction. When scientists speak about mental illness, they often begin with the brain and its role in thinking, what we call cognition, focusing on the central nervous system, as if it were the sole seat of psychological disturbance. Yet this view is incomplete because mental life is not limited to thought and central nervous system alone. It extends into feeling, bodily sensations, perception, and even anticipatory processes like intuition. In reality, what we call psychological illness is not confined to thinking errors, but involves a breakdown in the integration between multiple systems: cognitive, emotional, sensory, and bodily regulation. Feelings, for example, are not abstract, they are deeply rooted in the peripheral nervous system and autonomic regulation. Emotional states are expressed through heart rate, breathing, muscle tension, hormonal activity, and visceral responses. Chronic stress or trauma can alter the system so profoundly that emotional responses become distorted. Pleasure might begin to feel threatening, and neutral or even safe stimuli might evoke anxiety or discomfort and disproportional reactions. This is visible in conditions such as anxiety disorders, PTSD, ADHD, and depression, where the body itself learns maladaptive emotional patterns through repetition and conditioning. Sensation itself can also be dysregulated. The sensory system is plastic. Repeated exposure to certain stimuli can shift perception. In some cases, pleasurable sensations lose their positive valence, while previously neutral or even painful stimuli can become reinforcing. This is observed in addiction, chronic pain syndromes, and sensory processing disorders. The nervous system does not simply record reality, it adapts to it, and in doing so can become distorted. Even intuition, often understood as rapid pattern or recognition based on prior experience, can become maladaptive when it is shaped by trauma or chronic stress. In such cases, the brain generates excessive threat predictions in the absence of real danger, what might be described as a false alarm system. This is not mystical, but neurological. Predictive coding mechanisms in the brain become biased toward danger, producing persistent feelings of unease, mistrust, or anticipatory fear that do not correspond to external reality. In severe psychological conditions, this fragmentation can extend further. Clinical observations in neurology and psychiatry show that perception itself can become disorganized. Individuals may lose normal integration between sensation and interpretation, or experience hallucinations where sensory input is generated internally rather than externally. Conditions affecting the brain can also impair basic sensory functions: vision, hearing, pain perception, or emotional responsiveness, demonstrating that mental illness can indeed resemble a systematic disruption, not only of thought, but of the entire perceptual apparatus. At the same time, psychological states can become internally contradictory. A person might cognitively understand one thing, yet feel multiple conflicting emotions simultaneously. They might perceive the same situation through different emotional channels at once: fear and desire, trust and suspicion, desire and avoidance. This reflects a lack of integration between brain networks responsible for cognition, emotion, and bodily regulation. In such states, the individual is not simply broken, but rather unintegrated. Different systems operating under different interpretations of reality. One may think about one thing but feel two different and contrary feelings, or sense two different senses and feel the same feeling. One might be a whole in one way and split in another way. You might have various reasons to feel in one way and only one reason to feel in various ways. Once, during my teenage years, walking broke through the streets, after a long and exhausting day in a metal processing factory, I asked myself a question that at the time felt simple, yet carried enormous weight. Why are some people more successful than others? I was miserable, wearing the same worn out clothes every day, living at my maternal grandmother's house, who constantly complained about having no money. And even then, somewhere deep inside, I sensed that money itself was not the true problem, yet I could not see any perspective, any exit, any structural way out of that condition. I was falling behind in school to the point that I had to repeat a year, and this stagnation forced a reflection. The reason I asked that question was because I could not answer an even more fundamental one. Why do people love and why do they hate? These are not easy questions, especially without scientific preparation, because they sit at the intersection of biology, psychology, sociology, and philosophy. From there, a cascade of questions emerge. What is love? What is hate? Why do some individuals steal, lie, kill, while others refrain? At one point, I experienced a realization so intense that when I tried to explain it to a friend, he looked at me as if I were something alien. And that was the moment I understood a crucial principle. Knowledge and realization are not the one and the same thing. A person might know something abstractly, but to truly understand it, it must be experienced. Just as one might know everything about sugar, for example, its chemical composition, its crystalline structure, its metabolic pathways, yet until it touches the tongue, its essence is not realized. So it is with sex, sports, driving, intimacy, or pain. Experience transforms information into understanding. Everyone has a reason to behave in certain way, to feel and think in certain way. People are thankful and religious when everything is fine, but when broke and miserable, we see their limits. Human beings are neither completely identical nor completely equal in any absolute sense. This does not imply inequality in moral worth, but rather acknowledges observable variation. No two individuals occupy the same position in space and time. No two share identical genetics, upbringing, or environmental exposure. Each person begins life from a different starting point, with different parental conditions, socio-economic status, genetic predispositions, hereditary burden, and developmental opportunities. Some are born into stable families with nurturing parents, others into neglect, abuse, or complete absence of parental figures, as me. Some inherit wealth, networks, real estate, and education. Others inherit deprivation, instability, and limitation. Yet, despite these differences, there are universal laws that apply equally to all. Gravity, for example, does not discriminate. Whether a saint or a criminal jumps from a 20-story building, the outcome is one and the same, identical. This reflects this reflects what in physics is described by Newton's law of universal gravitation, a principle indifferent to morality. Whether you're a good person or bad person, if you jump from a 20-story building, the same will happen to you. You will get splat on the sidewalk. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you are right or wrong, and so on. The same applies to electricity. It can illuminate a room or kill a person, depending on how it is used, illustrating that laws are neutral. Outcomes depend on interaction. In human behavior, we may speak metaphorically of laws: the law of necessity, the law of obligation, the law of success, the law of deprivation, and so on. But unlike physical laws, these laws operate on the basis of probability rather than deterministically. Some produce consistent outcomes, others only under certain specific conditions. The fundamental issue is that while everyone has access to these laws, not everyone applies them effectively. Negative causes, whether in thought, language, or action, tend to produce negative consequences. If one harms others, one indirectly harms oneself, because human systems are interconnected biologically, socially, and psychologically. We are structured in such a way that we react positively to positive things and negatively to negative things. An interesting idea in the analytical psychology of Carl Jung is that who proposed that the psyche contains dual aspects, anima and animus, representing feminine and masculine principles within each individual. This implies that every person has the capacity for self nurturing, maternal function, and self discipline or protection, paternal function. However, empirical observation shows that not everyone develops these capacities. Some neglect themselves as poorly as neglected children, while others self regulate effectively. Similarly, Sigmund Freud formulated two governing principles of psychic life: the pleasure and unpleasure principle, and the reality principle, which can be interpreted as utility versus harm. The pleasure principle drives immediate gratification, reducing tension, seeking comfort, while the reality principle moderates behavior according to long term consequences. Before understanding these principles, one must recognize a biological constraint. Each individual possesses only one body, only one nervous system, and occupies only one subjective center of experience. We have one body, but at least two minds, conscious and unconscious. Pain is personal, hunger is personal, satisfaction is personal. When people eat in a restaurant, they satisfy their own physiological needs, not yours. This biological individuality explains why empathy is limited. Organisms are not directly connected at the level of sensation. Both humans and animals act primarily to regulate their own internal states. Every living creature is striving for its optimal conditions of existence. What we call animal behavior refers to instinctive, stimulus driven responses. Yet, not all human irrationality is purely instinctive. Some of it is developmental. When an adult constantly complains, avoids responsibility, and fails to act constructively, we often describe this as infantile or regressive behavior, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because their regulatory systems resemble earlier developmental stages. Biology provides extreme examples of how behavior can exist independently of higher cognition. Experiments have shown that decapitated chickens can continue moving due to residual neuronal activity in the spinal cord. Frogs, even when decerebrated, can perform coordinating wiping reflexes when their skin is stimulated. Isolated neural circuits can generate responses without conscious oversight. In classic physiological experiments, even severed animal heads, when artificially perfused with oxygenated fluid, displayed reflexive responses such as blinking or attempts at vocalization when stimulated. These findings demonstrate that behavior can arise from distributed neural mechanisms and electrochemical signals rather than centralized consciousness. At a more fundamental level, all living organisms respond to internal and external changes through specialized receptors. Baroreceptors detect pressure changes, chemoreceptors detect chemical variations, interoceptors monitor internal states, and exteroceptors respond to environmental stimuli such as light, sound, and touch, and nociceptors, which respond to pain. Contact receptors require direct interaction, while distance receptors, like vision and hearing, detect stimuli before contact occurs. These systems form the basis of perception and behavior, and they operate regardless of identity, status, or belief. And these systems vary from person to person. Whether the body belongs to a historical figure like Napoleon Bonaparte or Adolf Hitler, or to an anonymous individual, the biological processes remain the same: metabolism, decay, secretion, and eventual decomposition. Our bodies, without exception, are subject to entropy and biochemical breakdown. There is no creature on this earth insensible of pain, hunger, sexual pleasure, no creature independent of water, oxygen, food, and so on. Despite having a single body, humans possess multiple layers of mental processing. At minimum, we distinguish between conscious and unconscious processes. Though modern neuroscience suggests even more complex hierarchies involving automatic, emotional, and executive systems. The conscious mind represents only a fraction of total neural activity. Beneath it lies a vast network of unconscious processes shaping perception, decision making, and behavior. This duality explains why individuals often act against their own stated intentions. The organism operates on principles that are not fully accessible to conscious awareness. Thus, to understand success, failure, love, hatred, or any human behavior, one must integrate multiple levels of analysis: biological mechanisms, psychological structures, environmental conditions, and experiential learning, and so on, recognizing that knowledge alone is insufficient without lived realization, and that beneath all social differences lies a shared biological foundation governed by universal principles of adaptation, regulation, and survival. Part 1: The organism, the projection, and the first law of human conditioning. We enter this world not as personalities, not as moral beings, not as believers, skeptics, criminals, or saints, but as organisms, unfinished, unstructured, and unconditioned systems, governed entirely by biological necessity, by lower needs, a fact observed across developmental psychology, neurobiology, and psychoanalysis, where Sigmund Freud described the newborn as dominated by the id, pure instinctual demand, stating explicitly that the ego is not master in its own house. And indeed, no one has ever observed a negative baby, a depressed baby, a religious baby, or a nihilistic baby, because negativity, belief, morality, and ideology are not properties of the organism but constructions imposed later through conditioning, language, imitation, and social pressure. The infant is governed by hunger, discomfort, attachment, and discharge of tension, and this aligns with biological observations from Ivan Pavlov, who demonstrated that behavior can be shaped entirely through associative learning, proving that the organism does not begin with meaning but acquires it through repeated pairings of stimulus and response. And thus, what we call personality is not an origin but a consequence, a late, fragile, and often unstable achievement built upon layers of conditioning, reinforcement, learning, and inhibition. Yet, from the very beginning, a fundamental law imposes itself upon existence, no matter how intensely we strive, desire, or believe we deserve something. There exist boundaries, not moral boundaries, but structural ones. Things that cannot belong to us because they do not align with our conditions, our environment, our status, timing, and so on. Just as in the physical world, movement is impossible without resistance, without gravity, without friction, forces that oppose motion but make motion possible. So, too, in the psychological world, success requires constraints, principles, and meaning, what we might define as the why to and how to principles, without which effort dissipates into chaos. A principles echoed by Viktor Frankl, who wrote, those who have a why to live can bear almost any how, emphasizing that meaning is not decorative but functional. It organizes action, stabilizes perception, and directs behavior under pressure. When an external object enters perception, it does not exist in us as itself but is transformed into neural signals traveling along afferent pathways processed through cortical and subcortical systems and reconstructed internally, a process described in modern neuroscience by Eric Kandel, who demonstrated that perception and memory are encoded through synaptic plasticity, meaning that what we see is not reality but a biologically constructed representation. And here we arrive at a critical concept, the transition from reflection to projection, where the external world is first reflected through our senses, then transformed into neural activity, and then projected as a subjective experience in the brain. And what we experience is not the object itself, but the projection of that object filtered through prior conditioning, emotional associations, and biological states. This explains why different stimuli produce different reactions, not arbitrarily but specifically, because each stimulus carries a history of associations, and thus you do not react to a horse the same way you react to a small, fluffy cat, not to a triangle the same way as to a cube, because perception is not neutral but structured, layered, and conditioned, a principle formalized in behaviorism and later expanded into cognitive neuroscience. This specificity extends into desire and satisfaction, where quantity and quality interact dynamically, illustrated by simple biological experiences such as eating, where an initially attractive stimulus, aromatic, visually appealing, and stimulating, produces increased desire, yet after repeated consumption, the same stimulus produces decreasing satisfaction and eventually aversion, a phenomenon known as hedonic adaptation, and studied extensively in both psychology and economics, showing that satisfaction is not linear but saturating and can even reverse into rejection. And yet, a single contamination, for example, a fly in the soup, destroys desire instantly, not because of insufficient quantity of soup, but because of degraded quality of this soup, demonstrating that human valuation is not purely material but symbolic and contextual, involving perception of purity, safety, and integrity. Thus, we define as positive that which satisfies a need, and negative as that which obstructs or devalues it. Yet humans display paradoxical behavior, often pursuing pain and rejecting pleasure, not because pain is inherently desirable, but because conditioning, trauma, or distorted meaning have altered the underlying associations and brain structures, leading to what we may call inverted valuation systems, where the organism reacts against its own biological logic. This inversion becomes even more visible when we examine social structures when individuals are born into unequal conditions, what we may define as status quo and social economic status, terms deeply explored in sociology where inheritance, parental support, and environment determine opportunities long before individual effort begins, creating asymmetries that persist across decades, as noted by economists and social theorists, where one individual might inherit stability, housing, and networks, while another begins with deficit, instability, and deprivation. And these differences are not merely economic but psychological, shaping expectations, behavior, and even identity, leading to conflicts rooted not only in personality but in structural inequality. These inequalities influence relationships, attraction, desire, and social perception. As humans, despite claiming rationality, are driven largely by emotional and evolutionary biases, pri- prioritizing security, comfort, and status, a reality analyzed by Erich Fromm, who wrote in the book The Sane Society that the danger of the past was that men became slaves. The danger of the future is that men might become robots, highlighting how modern individuals conform to systems that prioritize security over authenticity. Biologically, these tendencies are grounded in the structure of the brain, where lower systems, brainstem and limbic regions govern survival, emotion, and instinct, while the prefrontal cortex enables inhibition, planning, and moral reasoning, and under stress, This hierarchy collapses downward, a process documented by Bessel van der Kolk, who showed that trauma reduces prefrontal activity and amplifies amygdala responses, leading to impulsive, compulsive, reactive behavior. And thus, what we call negativity is often not a belief, not an internal self image or identity, but a state, a condition in which the organism overrides the personality, producing regression into earlier modes and forms of functioning. This regression is not theoretical but observable across species, displaying uncontrolled aggression to, to primate studies by Jane Goodall, who documented both extreme violence and reconciliation within chimpanzee groups, demonstrating that aggression is not inherently negative but a biological force that can be constructive or destructive, depending on regulation. Similarly, early criminology attempted to locate the roots of deviance in biology, most notably through Cesare Lombroso, who proposed the theory of atavism, suggesting that criminals represent evolutionary regressions. And while his anatomical conclusions are now rejected, his observations of impulsivity, lack of foresight, emotional instability, maternal sexual sensorial deprivation, family rejection, homelessness, and so on align with modern findings of executive dysfunction, prefrontal lesion, hyperactive emotional brain, and hypertrophied vermis. Vermis on Latin, which means worm, of the small brain or cerebellum on the back of your head, and such other examinations found on autopsies, showing that crime is often less about ideology and more about failed regulation, negative social environment, failed parenting, and disorganization. This line of thinking resonates, not without controversy, with the perspective of Thomas Szasz, who argued that the language of mental illness can sometimes blur the boundary between explanation and excuse. His central concern was not to deny suffering, nor to dismiss the reality of psychological disturbance, but to challenge the automatic assumption that once a behavior is explained biologically or psychologically, it is therefore absolved of responsibility. In other words, to understand how a system operates, how certain neural circuits generate impulses, how conditioning shapes habits, how stress or trauma alters perception, is not the same as saying the individual is no longer accountable for his own actions. In other words, explaining how a system operates, how neural circuits generate impulses, how conditioning shapes habits, and how stress or trauma can distort perception, describes the mechanisms behind behavior, but it does not automatically remove accountability. These mechanisms influence what a person feels and tends to do, yet responsibility depends on the individual's capacity for awareness and control at a given moment. When a person can recognize their impulses, anticipate consequences, and regulate their actions, responsibility remains relatively high. When these capacities are significantly impaired, such as during extreme stress or severe mental disturbance, responsibility might be reduced but not necessarily eliminated. Thus, understanding the causes of behavior clarifies why something happens but Accountability concerns what the individual was able to do with that knowledge and capacity in that specific situation. From a functional standpoint, this distinction is crucial. Mechanisms describe processes. They show how reactions are triggered, how patterns are reinforced, how breakdowns and crises occur. They allow prediction, intervention, and sometimes prevention. But responsibility operates at a different level. It concerns the capacity of the individual to regulate, inhibit, redirect, or at least recognize these processes and analyze them. The existence of a mechanism does not negate the possibility of modulation. A person might be predisposed toward impulsivity, negativity, aggression, or withdrawal, but predisposition is not identical with inevitability. At the same time, a rigid interpretation of responsibility, one that ignores biology, development, and context, is equally flawed. Systems fail for reasons. Neural dysregulation, chronic stress exposure, early deprivation, and learned patterns all shape what a person can realistically control at a given moment. The challenge then is not to choose between mechanism and responsibility, but to hold both simultaneously, to see behavior as caused and constrained, yet still situated within a framework where agency, however limited, can be expanded, trained, or diminished. In this sense, labeling becomes a double edged tool. It can clarify patterns and guide treatment, but it can also fix identity and reduce complex behavior to a static category. The deeper task is to move beyond labels toward understanding systems, how they function when integrated, how they fragment under pressure, and under what conditions they can be reorganized. Accountability then is not erased by explanation, it is reframed. It becomes less about blame in a moralistic sense and more about the capacity and sometimes the obligation to engage with one's own mechanisms, to recognize them, and, where possible, to bring them under regulation rather than surrendering to them. Psychological thinkers like William James argue that human behavior is driven far more by habit than by belief. In simple terms, what you repeatedly do shapes you more than what you say you believe in. A person might value patience, honesty, or discipline, but under pressure, it is not these ideals that act first. It is the trained pattern, the automatic response built through repetition. This is why James suggested that we are constantly building our faith through habits. Every repeated action strengthens a pathway, making it more likely to occur again, especially in moments of stress when conscious control weakens. Building on this, Alfred Adler proposed that human beings are fundamentally driven by a striving for significance, a need to feel capable, effective, and valued. When this striving is fulfilled in healthy ways, it leads to growth, cooperation, and contribution. But when it is blocked through failure, rejection, inferiority, or lack of opportunity, it does not disappear. Instead, it often distorts. The individual may compensate by seeking power, control, or relief through less adaptive means, aggression, domination, manipulation, or self destructive behavior. This is what can be called a compensatory pathology, not random dysfunction, but a misguided attempt to restore a sense of importance or control. From here, we can make a crucial distinction between the organism and the personality. Harris Tax Sullivan wrote that what we call personality is something artificial and is an illusion, not a biological derivative. The organism is the biological base, immediate, reactive, driven by survival, instinct, and impulse. It seeks quick solutions, relief from tension, avoidance of pain, acquisition of reward, and so on. The personality, on the other hand, is a higher level structure. It is built over time through learning, conditioning, reflection, socialization, intellectualization, and meaning. It allows delay, planning, self regulation, and alignment with long term goals rather than immediate urges. Under stable conditions, the personality organizes and regulates the organism, but under stress, fatigue, fear, deprivation, humiliation, chronic pressure, this structure can weaken. When that happens, the organism does not disappear, it reemerges. Behavior becomes more impulsive, more reactive, more short term. This is not evil in a moral sense, it is regression, a shift from higher order regulation to more primitive automatic patterns. In this state, what we often call negativity is not simply a pessimistic attitude but a functional collapse of regulation. The person is no longer guiding behavior consciously, instead, behavior is driven by conditioned reactions, emotional surges, and environmental triggers. The individual stops shaping reality through deliberate choice and begins to be shaped by it, responding rather than directing. Seen this way, the central struggle in human life is not simply between good and evil, but between regulation and breakdown, between structure and chaos. It is the ongoing effort to maintain a coherent, organized personality over a powerful, ever present biological foundation that is faster, older, and always ready to take control when the system is strained. This was an introduction in chapter 1 from my book, Psychopathia Mentalis. Everything you have just heard is only the beginning. This book is not written to entertain you, it is written to reorganize the way you understand yourself, your emotions, and your behavior. Most people go through life reacting without understanding the mechanisms behind their reactions. They think in fragments, thoughts here, feelings there, impulses somewhere else. But what you have seen in this first chapter is that none of these are separate. They're part of one system, and once you understand that system, you stop being controlled by it unconsciously. What this book offers is not motivation and not advice, it is structure, a way of seeing human behavior as a unified process from biology to psychology to action. And once you see that structure clearly, you cannot unsee it. It changes how you interpret fear, desire, addiction, relationships, even your own identity. If this resonates with you, then the full work will take you much deeper into patterns of behavior, conditioning, rewards, trauma, and meaning, not as abstract theory, but as something you can recognize in yourself and others every day. So, if you feel that this is something worth continuing, you can get access to the full book and follow the complete framework I have built. Everything starts from this point on, but it doesn't end here. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel To join the Discord group, you can like my Facebook page or contact me directly through WhatsApp. Thank you.